The Appalachian foothills of Eagle Creek, Kentucky, were a far cry from the dusty plains of Helmand Province. For Sergeant Major Elias Eli Carter, the shift had been jarring, like waking from a nightmare into a world that no longer quite fit. The familiar scent of pine and damp earth replaced the acrid tang of burning diesel and distant explosions. The chirping of crickets and the hoot of owls superseded the crackle of radio chatter and the thud of mortar fire. 22 years of ingrained vigilance didn't simply dissipate with a discharged paper. Every rustle in the leaves could be an unseen threat, every distant vehicle rumble a potential IED. His senses, honed to a razor's edge by years of combat, remained on high alert, even here in the deceptive peace of his childhood home. Eli had always been a man of the mountains, even before he became a Marine. Growing up in a small, weathered cabin nestled deep in these woods, he'd learned the language of the land. His father, a quiet man who worked the coal mines but lived for the hunt, had taught him to read the subtle shifts in the wind, to understand the silent warnings of the creatures that called this place home, to find solace in the vast, indifferent beauty of nature. That connection to the wilderness, to the ancient rhythms of the earth, had been a grounding force throughout his long service. It was a quiet whisper of home, a mental sanctuary he could retreat to even in the most hostile environments. He could close his eyes amidst the chaos of a firefight, and, for a fleeting second, conjure the image of a sun-dappled stream, the scent of wildflowers, the whisper of the wind through the pines. That brief mental escape had often kept him anchored to something beyond the immediate brutality. Now, retired and back in the very cabin he'd left as a young man, Eli found himself wrestling with a different kind of battle. The physical wounds, the network of shrapnel scars that webbed across his left leg, the persistent ache in his lower back from carrying too much gear, too many miles, too much responsibility, were a constant, throbbing reminder of his time in Afghanistan. But it was the invisible wounds, the echoes of the friends he'd lost, the faces of the children he couldn't save, the crushing weight of impossible decisions, that truly haunted him. They were shapeless, persistent, and insidious, seeping into the quiet corners of his mind, turning the peaceful silence of the mountains into a cacophony of memories. Days bled into weeks, marked only by the rising and setting sun. Eli spent his time tending a small vegetable garden, finding a methodical, almost meditative rhythm in turning the soil and coaxing life from the earth. He split firewood with a relentless energy, each swing of the axe a temporary release for the tension that coiled in his shoulders. And he took long, solitary walks through the woods, his old hunting rifle slung over his shoulder more from habit than necessity. He avoided town, the well-meaning but often clueless questions of the locals grating on his raw nerves. "So you're back now? Good to be home, huh?" they'd ask, their eyes filled with a curiosity he didn't know how to satisfy. How could he explain that home felt different now, that a part of him remained on those distant battlefields, perpetually scanning for threats, perpetually listening for the cries he couldn't answer? He tried sometimes. He tried to explain the phantom vibrations in his pockets, the expectation of his comms radio crackling to life. He tried to articulate the persistent ringing in his ears, a tinnitus that never faded, a constant reminder of explosions too close. Or the sudden, overwhelming scent of burning diesel and human waste that could appear from nowhere, instantly transporting him back to a crowded Afghan bazaar just moments before an attack. He attempted to describe the crushing weight of command, the impossible ethical dilemmas, the burden of sending young men into harm's way, knowing some wouldn't return. But the words sounded hollow, inadequate, unable to convey the true depth of the experience. People would nod, offer platitudes of sympathy, but their eyes remained vacant, unable to truly grasp the chasm that separated his reality from theirs. It was a barrier, more solid than any concrete bunker, more impenetrable than any fortified wall. He learned quickly that silence was often the kinder option, for himself and for them. One crisp autumn night, as the moon hung high and full above the bare branches of the oak trees, Eli sat on the rickety porch of his cabin. The sounds of the forest were loud and clear, but not threatening, the rhythmic hoot of a great horned owl, the rustle of the wind through the pine needles, the distant babbling of Eagle Creek. He heard them, yet through them, another echo seeped in, faint cries from a distant village, the muffled thud of machine gun fire, a desperate plea for help in a language he had learned to understand. He closed his eyes, squeezing them tight, trying to push the images away, but they were there, vivid and visceral, as if happening right now. It was a flashback, one of the many that had become his new, unwelcome companions. He could taste the dust and the metallic tang of blood, feel the tremor of the earth beneath him from unseen explosions. His hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white, and he took deep, shuddering breaths, trying desperately to anchor himself back to the present. When he finally opened his eyes, the familiar forest was still there, peaceful and unchanged. But inside him, the world was still turned upside down, a chaotic storm of memories and emotions. He felt a profound sense of isolation, a crushing loneliness that no amount of solitude could alleviate. He was a ghost walking among the living, carrying burdens no one else could see. A few days later, on a dreary autumn morning, a battered pickup truck rumbled up the long, winding gravel driveway to Eli's cabin. The sound was alien, an intrusion in his carefully constructed quiet. He tensed, his hand instinctively going to the hunting knife he kept on a shelf by the door. Visitors were rare, and almost always unwelcome. From his window, he watched as a woman stepped out, her face etched with a weary determination that Eli recognized instantly. Sarah Jenkins was the director of the local Veterans Outreach Center, a small, underfunded organization that did its best to support the area's returning service members. She wasn't wearing a uniform, but her bearing spoke of a quiet resolve, a strength he understood. Eli hadn't sought their help, hadn't filled out any forms or attended any meetings. He preferred his solitude, his quiet struggle, believing he could manage it on his own, as he always had. He was a sergeant major, for Christ's sake, he didn't need handouts or hand-holding. So Sarah's presence on his doorstep was unexpected, a breach in the invisible perimeter he'd meticulously built around himself. "Mr. Carter?" she asked, her voice gentle but firm. She stood a respectful distance from the porch, about 10 feet, acknowledging his need for space, not crowding him as many others might have. Her posture was open, non-threatening, but her gaze was steady and unwavering. Eli nodded, his eyes wary, still weighing whether to simply retreat inside. He had already donned the mask of indifference he'd worn for years, a shield to ward off unwelcome guests and probing questions. "I know you haven't reached out to us," Sarah continued, her voice maintaining its even tone, ignoring his unspoken resistance. "But we've heard about you. Folks in town, they worry." Eli internally scoffed. Worry was a luxury he felt he no longer deserved, a sentiment he reserved for the men he'd commanded, for the innocent civilians caught in the crossfire. They didn't worry about his actual state. They worried about the strange old man who didn't fit their idyllic picture of a returned hero, the one who didn't come to church socials or talk about football. They worried about the silence, because silence in their world often meant something was wrong. "We have a program starting next week," Sarah said, her voice becoming a touch softer, but the underlying resolve was still there, like the sturdy roots of an oak tree. "A peer support group. Just veterans, sharing their experiences. No pressure to talk if you don't want to. But sometimes, just being around others who understand, it can make a difference. It's not about fixing you, Mr. Carter. It's about not having to carry the weight alone." Eli hesitated. The thought of opening up, of reliving those memories in front of strangers, was daunting. He imagined the pity in their eyes, the awkward silences, the desperate attempts to relate. He saw the potential for his carefully constructed walls to crumble, exposing the raw, wounded man beneath. But then, a different thought occurred. What if they did understand? What if there were others who knew the precise ache in his bones, the specific haunting of the past, the exact taste of survivor's guilt? There was a flicker of something else too, a desperate yearning for connection, a desperate need to feel understood in a way his civilian neighbors never could. It was a fragile hope, a tiny spark in the vast darkness of his isolation. "I'll think about it," he said finally, the words feeling heavy and unfamiliar in his mouth, a rusty mechanism creaking back to life. It was a concession, a small crack in his armor. Too many times before, he would have simply shut the door, offering no response. Sarah smiled, a genuine, hopeful curve of her lips that reached her tired eyes. That's all I ask? She walked closer, not to the porch, but to the edge of the driveway, and handed him a small, hand-printed flyer. The paper was slightly creased, indicating it had been carried. Monday, 10 a.m., she added, her voice a final, gentle push, before turning back to her truck and driving away, leaving Eli alone once more, but with a new, unsettling possibility hanging in the air. He stood there for a long time, the flyer clutched in his hand, the paper surprisingly warm against his skin, a tangible link to a world he had deliberately shut out. The weight of his solitude felt heavier now, compounded by the flickering possibility of something different. The following week, Eli found himself driving towards the Veterans Outreach Center, a knot of anxiety tightening in his stomach, as persistent as the dull ache in his back. The old pickup truck rattled along the winding country roads, each bump a jarring reminder of his physical discomfort, each mile bringing him closer to an unknown challenge. He almost turned back a dozen times, the familiar urge to retreat into his solitude overwhelming, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. He saw the inviting shadows of the forest calling him back to the quiet, to the safe refuge of his cabin, where the only judgments were his own, where the only demons were familiar. But something Sarah had said, just being around others who understand, kept pulling him forward, like an invisible thread tugging at his very core, a faint radio signal cutting through the static of his self-imposed isolation. He felt it, a nascent, almost imperceptible pull towards something he couldn't quite name, but instinctively knew he needed. The center was a modest building, a converted storefront on the edge of town, with a faded American flag hanging resolutely in the window, its colors muted by countless sunrises and sunsets. Inside, the air was surprisingly warm and smelled faintly of brewing coffee and old paper. A small group of veterans sat in a loose circle of mismatched chairs, their faces a mix of apprehension and quiet strength. Some sat rigidly, their postures still betraying years of military discipline, their eyes scanning the room, assessing, evaluating. Others slumped, their shoulders carrying an invisible burden, their gazes fixed on the floor or the chipped paint on the walls. Eli recognized the signs. These were men and women who had seen too much, carried too much, and now struggled to find their footing in a world that didn't quite grasp their experiences. Sarah greeted Eli warmly, her smile genuine and welcoming, and introduced him to the others. Eli, this is Marcus, Emily, and David, she said, gesturing to each in turn. There was Marcus, a former army medic who had lost his leg in Iraq. His prosthetic was visible beneath his trousers, but his eyes were sharp and full of a quiet, unyielding life, observing everything with the practiced calm of someone who had faced death and chosen to stay. He offered a slight nod. Then Emily, an Air Force pilot still grappling with the trauma of a near-fatal mission where her F-16 had been hit by catastrophic mechanical failure. Her gaze was intensely focused, yet sometimes drifted, lost in an unseen distance, perhaps replaying the terrifying descent. She gave a small, hesitant wave. And finally David, a Marine who had served multiple tours in Afghanistan and now struggled with severe PTSD, his nervous tics noticeable, a constant tremor in his hands, a habit of glancing over his shoulder, but in his eyes, despite the torment, there was an unmistakable kindness. He offered a strained smile. For the first few sessions, Eli remained largely silent, a silent sentinel in the circle, listening intently to the others share their stories. He was a sponge, absorbing the raw emotion, the familiar language of their suffering. He heard echoes of his own experiences in their words, the adrenaline-fueled chaos of combat, the crushing weight of responsibility, the gnawing guilt of survival. He felt a strange mixture of relief and sorrow, relief to know he wasn't alone in his struggles, sorrow for the shared burdens they all carried. Marcus spoke first, his voice gravelly but steady. He talked about the MASH unit, the endless stream of wounded, the split-second decisions that determined life or death. You just act, he said, his voice tightening slightly with the memory. You don't think about yourself. You just do what needs to be done. It's a blur of blood and screaming, and then, suddenly, it's quiet, and you realize you made it, but others didn't. Eli nodded, understanding that automatic, almost instinctual reaction, that terrible shift into survival mode that became a second nature, overriding fear, overriding self-preservation. He knew the haunting quiet that followed the storm. Emily recounted her time in the cockpit, the exhilarating rush of flying her F-16, the sense of invincibility as she soared through the sky. Then, she described the sudden, terrifying jolt when her jet was crippled by an unforeseen mechanical failure, the chaotic scramble to regain control, the agonizing moments as she plunged towards the earth. "It wasn't the enemy," she whispered, her voice trembling, her eyes wide with a residual fear. "It was a malfunction. You trained for everything else, but not for your own equipment betraying you. You don't know how to fight your own damn plane." Eli could vividly imagine that feeling, the loss of control, the betrayal of the very technology they relied upon, the sheer terror of an unseen, unidentifiable threat. He knew the helplessness. David, the Marine, spoke with a halting, fragmented voice, describing the nightmares that relentlessly dragged him back to that same narrow alley in Fallujah, where they had been ambushed. He spoke of the deafening crack of gunfire, the terrified screams of his comrades, the haunting image of a young Marine, barely out of high school, falling beside him. He described waking up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding, convinced he was back there, the stench of dust and cordite filling his nostrils. He recounted how every loud sound, every sudden movement, could instantly transport him back, leaving him breathless and trembling. He slept with a knife under his pillow, a futile attempt to regain some semblance of control over his tormented sleep. His hands trembled noticeably as he spoke, twisting a small, worn piece of fabric. Eli felt the cold sweat pricking his own forehead as David spoke. He knew this nightmarish cycle, these unwanted, visceral visits from the past, the constant vigilance that bled into sleep. As Eli listened, a strange dam inside him began to crack. He had spent years building it, brick by painstaking brick, cementing it with silence and stoicism. But these were not strangers. These were fellow warriors, carrying their own burdens, their own invisible scars. He was no longer a lone sentinel, but a part of a unit again. Slowly, tentatively, he began to speak, his voice rough at first, and used to articulating such raw emotion, then gaining a fragile strength as he found a safe space to share his burden. He started with Sergeant Miller, his best friend, who had been killed by an IED right beside him. He recounted the moment with stark, chilling detail, the blinding flash of white light, the searing heat, the deafening roar that stole all other sound, and then the crushing silence that followed, broken only by his own ragged, desperate breathing. He described Miller's last words, a garbled, desperate plea for his wife, Sarah, a promise Eli had sworn to keep, to find her, to tell her about his last moments, though he never knew how or if he even should. The guilt of survival, of being the one left behind while Miller, a younger man with a new family, was gone, had been a constant, gnawing companion, a heavy, suffocating cloak he wore every waking moment. He hadn't talked about Miller to anyone, not really. It was a wound too deep, too personal, too sacred to expose to the uncomprehending civilian world. But in this circle, surrounded by understanding eyes that had seen their own Millers, the words finally spilled out, raw and unfiltered, carrying the full weight of 50 years of unexpressed grief. He saw the collective intake of breath around the circle, the knowing glances, the shared pain. Then, he spoke of the Afghan children he had tried to help, their innocent faces forever imprinted on his memory, a kaleidoscope of bright eyes and hopeful smiles amidst the widespread devastation. He described the desperate, often futile attempts to share his MREs, the small toys he carried secretly in his pack, a broken plastic car, a tattered doll, the futile efforts to shield them from the senseless violence that engulfed their young lives. He remembered one little girl, no older than 7, with enormous, luminous eyes, who had offered him a single, wilting poppy amidst the rubble of her home after a bombing. Her face, etched with a resilience that defied her tender age and the horrors she had witnessed, had become a symbol of both profound hope and crushing despair for him. He carried the weight of every child he couldn't protect, every fleeting smile that turned into a heart-wrenching scream, every hopeful glance that faded into terror. These were the ghosts that walked with him daily, far more numerous and tormenting than any enemy combatant. Finally, he recounted the immense weight of command, the impossible, agonizing decisions he had been forced to make in the brutal heat of battle, decisions that no human being should ever have to make. The stark choice between two terrible options, the lives that hung precariously in the balance, the unbearable burden of sending young men, barely out of their teens, into harm's way, knowing with gut-wrenching certainty that some would not return. He spoke of the sleepless nights spent replaying scenarios, dissecting every tactical decision, agonizing over what he could have done differently, how many more lives he could have saved, whether the cost was truly justified. He had been a leader, a rock for his men, a figure of unwavering strength and resolve, but inside, he was just a man wrestling with the agonizing ghosts of his past, the faces of those lost etched into his soul. As Eli shared his story, a profound quiet settled over the room, broken only by the occasional sniffle. He saw nods of understanding, tears of empathy trickling down weathered cheeks, and the shared, familiar pain in the eyes of his fellow veterans. For the first time since coming home, he didn't feel so utterly alone. They understood the unspoken language of war, the shorthand of suffering, the invisible scars that ran deeper than any physical wound. They didn't offer empty platitudes or misguided advice, no. "Thank you for your service." That felt hollow and meaningless. They simply listened, their presence a silent affirmation that he wasn't broken, just profoundly wounded, and that healing, though arduous, was indeed possible. They were not just witnesses to his pain, they were co-travelers on the same difficult path. The peer support group became a lifeline for Eli. He found solace in their shared experiences, strength in their collective resilience, and a nascent hope in their collective journey towards healing. They talked, they listened, they supported each other through the dark days, the relentless nightmares, and the paralyzing anxieties. They celebrated the small victories, a full night's sleep, a successful outing to the grocery store, a moment of unburdened laughter. They openly discussed coping mechanisms for triggers, the sudden bark of a dog, the backfire of a car, the overwhelming sensory assault of a crowded public place. They shared resources, tips for navigating the labyrinthine vase system, and even simple recipes for comfort food that reminded them of home or brought a flicker of joy. They were a microcosm of the very unit he had once led, a band of brothers and sisters, wounded but unbowed, finding strength in unity, building a new kind of camaraderie. One day, David, the Marine with severe PTSD, shared his particularly acute struggle with nightmares, vivid, horrifying replays of traumatic events that left him exhausted, disoriented, and utterly on edge. He described waking up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs, convinced he was back in Fallujah, the stench of dust and cordite filling his nostrils. He had tried everything, various medications that only dulled his senses, countless therapy sessions that felt like picking at scabs, mindfulness meditation that proved impossible to maintain amidst the internal chaos. But the nightmares persisted, eroding his sleep, his peace of mind, and his will to face another day. He looked utterly defeated. Eli, remembering the profound peace he found in the quiet solitude of the mountains, the grounding comfort he drew from being immersed in nature, suggested something simple. "David," he said, his voice softer than usual, "have you tried just being out in the woods? Not hiking, not doing anything. Just finding a quiet spot and letting the silence soak in?" David looked skeptical, but Eli persisted. "Find a spot by the creek, or a thicket where the sun filters through the leaves. Just sit. Listen. Let the sounds of the water, the wind, the birds just be. No expectations. Just presence." Eli described how, even in the depths of Afghanistan, he would often find a quiet moment, a small patch of untouched nature, a single resilient flower pushing through cracked earth, the distant call of a desert bird, and allowed that small connection to ground him, to remind him of something beyond the immediate brutality. It was a fleeting anchor, but it had always helped. The following week, David returned to the group with a subtle but noticeable shift in his demeanor. The tension in his shoulders was slightly eased, the nervous tremor in his hands less pronounced. He hadn't slept through the night, but he hadn't woken up screaming either. He had found a secluded spot by Eagle Creek, just as Eli had suggested. He described the hypnotic sound of the flowing water, the soft rustling of the leaves in the canopy above, the gentle hum of insects, all conspiring to create a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. It was like the noise in my head just quieted down, he stammered, still slightly awestruck by the experience. For a little while, I could actually just be. Inspired by David's experience, the group began organizing regular outdoor activities. It started small, short hikes along the less challenging trails around Eagle Creek, simple fishing trips to quiet pockets of the river, or just gathering in a secluded clearing to share a thermos of coffee and listen to the birds. It wasn't about strenuous activity or achieving a goal. It was about simply being present, together, in the healing embrace of nature. Eli, with his deep, almost innate knowledge of the local wilderness, became their natural guide. He led them to hidden trails that snaked through ancient stands of trees, to serene overlooks offering panoramic views of the rolling Appalachian landscape, to secluded spots by cascading waterfalls where the roar of the water could drown out even the loudest internal demons. He taught them how to read the subtle signs of the forest, the tracks of deer and wild turkey, the call of a specific bird signaling an approaching storm, the edible berries and medicinal plants hidden amongst the undergrowth. He showed them how to find solace in its quiet rhythms, how to shed the frantic pace of the modern world and attune themselves to something older, slower, more profound. As they walked through the woods, they shared more stories, their conversations flowing as easily as the creek beside them. They laughed, a sound that had been rare for many of them, finding humor in shared mishaps and common experiences. They built a new kind of camaraderie, one that transcended their military service, rooted now in the shared journey of healing and the quiet beauty of the natural world. Eli, who had once found communication with civilians almost impossible, found himself talking freely, pointing out specific trees, identifying bird calls, sharing anecdotes from his childhood in these very woods. The forest, once his personal sanctuary, now became a communal healing ground. One crisp autumn afternoon, as the group sat by a particularly beautiful bend in Eagle Creek, the sunlight dappling through the golden leaves like liquid gold, Emily, the former pilot, spoke of her lingering guilt over a mission where civilians had been inadvertently harmed. Her squadron had followed protocol, dropped their ordnance on a designated target, but intelligence had been flawed, and a nearby compound, mistakenly identified as enemy infrastructure, had suffered collateral damage. She described the chilling debrief, the cold, clinical assessment of acceptable losses. But the faces of the victims, seen only from grainy aerial footage, haunted her waking hours. I can't shake it, she confessed, her voice thin with anguish. I pushed the button. Even if it was an order, even if I didn't know, it was my hand. Eli listened intently, his gaze fixed on the flowing water, a flicker of something ancient in his pale blue eyes. He understood that specific kind of guilt, the one that clung to the soul like tar. He then shared a story of a similar incident from his own deployment, a heavy burden he had carried in silence for years, a tale he had never uttered aloud to anyone. He recounted a patrol gone wrong, a snap decision made in the fog of war that, while saving his men, had inadvertently led to harm for innocent bystanders. He didn't offer excuses or justifications, only the raw truth of the moment, the terror, the split-second choice, and the enduring, crushing weight of its consequence. It's never clean, Emily, Eli said, his voice raspy. And it never leaves you. The best we can do is carry it, acknowledge it, and then find a way to live with it. To learn from it. To make sure that their loss means something more than just a statistic. By sharing his own profound and long-held pain, he didn't offer a solution, but he gave Emily something far more valuable: permission to forgive herself, to accept the complexities and the unintended consequences of war, to know that her feelings were valid, and that she wasn't alone in carrying that particular, brutal weight. A silent understanding passed between them, a recognition of shared suffering. Through their shared experiences in the group and their growing connection to the natural world, the veterans of Eagle Creek began to heal in ways they hadn't thought possible. They learned that vulnerability was not a weakness but a profound strength, that sharing their deepest wounds allowed them to breathe, to truly begin the arduous journey of recovery. They understood that healing was a journey best traveled together, supported by those who truly understood, without judgment or naive platitudes. Eli, who had once sought only solitude, found a new sense of purpose in helping his fellow veterans find their own paths towards peace. The forest, once his personal sanctuary, became a communal healing ground, its quiet wisdom slowly seeping into their troubled souls. The success of the outdoor activities sparked an idea within the group, an organic evolution beyond the confines of their weekly meetings. David, with his newfound calm and connection to nature, proposed expanding their efforts, not just for themselves, but for other veterans in the area who might be struggling in isolation. "There are so many more out there, like Eli was, just shut in," David said, his voice surprisingly steady. "They need this. They need the woods. They need us." Sarah, ever the pragmatist, saw the potential, but also the challenges. "It's a wonderful idea, David. But funding is tight. And we need more volunteers, more equipment. It's a big step." Eli, usually reserved, surprised them all by stepping forward. "I know these woods," he stated, his voice low but firm. "I can scout trails, teach basic wilderness survival. I can help organize. And I know plenty of old-timers who'd lend a hand, maybe even donate some gear, if they knew it was for our vets." His words carried the weight of decades of experience and respect, a silent testament to his deep roots in the community, even after his long absence. His offer was a turning point, signaling his full re-engagement with the world. And so the Eagle Creek Veterans Wilderness Program was born. It started with small, informal gatherings, Eli leading new groups of veterans on guided walks, teaching them about local flora and fauna, demonstrating basic knots or how to identify edible plants. Marcus, despite his prosthetic, discovered a passion for identifying medicinal herbs and shared his knowledge of their uses. Emily, with her meticulous planning skills from her flying days, became the logistical mastermind, organizing transportation, supplies, and schedules. David, surprisingly, became their most effective recruiter, his own transformation a powerful testament to the program's benefits. He would visit other struggling veterans, share his story, and gently encourage them to join. The program quickly grew. Veterans from neighboring counties began to hear about the healing power of the woods and the genuine camaraderie offered by the Eagle Creek group. They ranged from young service members recently returned from Iraq and Afghanistan, grappling with the immediacy of their trauma, to older Vietnam veterans, who had carried their burdens in silence for half a century, often misunderstood and neglected by society. Eli, through his quiet leadership, created an environment where everyone felt safe to share, or not to share, whatever their pace of healing required. He simply led them, walked beside them, and listened. One significant challenge arose when a local landowner, Mr. Henderson, a gruff, traditional man who owned a large tract of pristine forest bordering Eagle Creek, became wary of the increased activity. He valued his privacy and was fiercely protective of his land. Rumors of outsiders trampling his property reached him, fueled by a few less welcoming locals. He confronted Eli one afternoon, his face red with indignation. "What's all this ruckus, Carter? My family's owned this land for generations. We don't take kindly to strangers tramping through our woods." Eli, known for his calm under pressure, met Mr. Henderson's anger with quiet resolve. He explained the program, not as a demand, but as an appeal. "Mr. Henderson," Eli said, his voice low and steady, "these aren't just strangers. These are our veterans. They served. They fought. Some of them are hurting in ways you and I can barely imagine. We're not tramping. We're healing. We're trying to help them find a way back home, right here, in these woods, just like you and I always have." He pointed to his own leg, the faint outline of scars visible beneath his pants. "I understand your land, sir. I grew up in these parts. But these men and women, they need a place to breathe. A quiet place where the only sounds are the ones that heal." Mr. Henderson stared at Eli, his anger slowly receding, replaced by a flicker of understanding, perhaps even a hint of respect for the old soldier who stood before him, calm and unyielding. He had heard about Eli's service, about the lost Carter who had returned. He ran a calloused hand over his chin. "All right, Carter," he finally grumbled. "I'll let you use the old logging road on the far side. But keep 'em off my hunting grounds. And clean up after yourselves." It wasn't a warm embrace, but it was an acceptance, a grudging permission that opened up miles of new, vital trails for the program. Eli knew it was a major victory. The program flourished. Word spread beyond the county lines. Sarah secured a small grant from a national veterans organization, allowing them to purchase more proper gear, rent a larger van for transport, and even offer basic first aid and wilderness training courses. The local community, initially hesitant, began to rally around them. Local businesses offered discounts on supplies, volunteers from the town started helping with administrative tasks, and even some of the older residents would bring baked goods for the returning hikers. The old storefront, once just a meeting place, began to transform into a vibrant hub, a place of hope and healing. Eli, once the silent recluse, found himself speaking more, not just in the group, but to community members, to local officials, advocating for the program, explaining its importance. He shared his own story, not just the pain, but the slow, arduous process of finding peace, a peace he now recognized was largely due to his return to these mountains and, more importantly, to the connection he'd forged with his fellow veterans. He taught others about the invisible wounds of war, about compassion and understanding, about the profound healing power of nature and camaraderie. One frigid winter evening, a call came into the center, shattering the relative calm. It was from a frantic wife, her voice choked with desperation. Her husband, 28-year-old Mike Rodriguez, a former Army Ranger who had recently returned from his third deployment to Afghanistan, had locked himself in his garage. He hadn't left the house in days, was barely eating, and had been drinking heavily. Now, he was threatening to end it all. Mike had attended a few group sessions a month ago but had quickly retreated, overwhelmed by the vulnerability required. Eli remembered him, a quiet man, broad-shouldered, with eyes that held a deep, unsettling sadness. He had a faint scar above his eyebrow, a testament to some forgotten incident, but it was the profound weariness in his gaze that had struck Eli the most. He was carrying a world of pain, and Eli recognized the signs of a man teetering on the brink. Sarah immediately called Eli. "Eli, it's Mike Rodriguez. His wife just called. He's in his garage, says he's done. The police are on their way, but I don't know if they can talk him down. He needs someone who understands." Eli didn't hesitate. "Send me the address. I'm on my way." He grabbed his heavy winter coat, his old boots, and his hunting knife. The familiar knot of tension tightened in his stomach, but this time, it wasn't anxiety for himself, it was the sharp, urgent fear for a fellow warrior. This wasn't a battle fought with rifles and grenades, but it was a battle for a soul, and it felt just as vital, just as dangerous. The drive was tense, the icy roads mirroring the cold dread in Eli's gut. When he arrived, the scene was chaotic. Two sheriff's deputies were trying to talk to Mike through the garage door, their voices amplified by the cold night air, sounding stiff and authoritative. Mike's wife, Maria, stood huddled with a neighbor, shivering, tears streaming down her face. A patrol car's blue and red lights pulsed silently in the dark, casting an eerie glow on the snow-covered lawn. Eli walked calmly towards the deputies. "I'm Eli Carter. From the Veterans Outreach Center. I served." His voice was steady, projecting quiet authority. The deputies, recognizing the worn but still sharp bearing of a seasoned soldier, exchanged a glance. "We've got it, sir," one said. "Just let us handle it. We don't need any civilians getting involved." "He's a Marine, son," Eli replied, his voice hardening slightly. "He needs someone who's been there. You can't talk him down with protocol. You need to talk to his war." Sarah arrived then, confirming Eli's identity. Reluctantly, the deputies allowed Eli to approach the garage door. He could hear muffled sounds inside, the clinking of bottles, the sound of heavy breathing, a low, guttural moan. Eli knelt by the garage door, pressing his ear against the cold metal. "Mike!" he called out, his voice low, calm, devoid of any judgment or urgency, just a quiet, steady presence. "Mike, this is Eli. Sergeant Major Carter. Remember? From the group. I know you're in there. I'm not leaving." Silence from inside, save for a faint clink. "I know it's dark in there, Mike," Eli continued, his voice a low hum, reminiscent of the steady rhythms of the forest. "I know that feeling. That black hole. That echo that never stops. The faces. The sounds. The smells. They can bury you alive. I've been buried alive too, son. Many times." He waited. He didn't demand, didn't push. He simply existed, a quiet, unwavering anchor in the storm Mike was experiencing. He spoke of the weight of command, the impossible choices, the friends he'd lost, the children he couldn't save. He spoke of Miller, his best friend, and the crushing guilt he still carried. He shared details of his own nightmares, the ones that had kept him awake for months after coming home. He talked about the burning diesel, the dust, the constant hypervigilance. He didn't sugarcoat it, didn't offer empty platitudes. He spoke the brutal, honest truth of his own pain, a truth that could only come from someone who had walked through the same hell. After what felt like an eternity, a raw, choked sob came from inside the garage. Then, a voice, hoarse and broken. "Sergeant Major? Why are you here? You shouldn't be here." "Because you're not alone, Mike," Eli replied, his voice laced with an empathy that resonated deeply with the younger man. "And you don't have to carry this alone. None of us do. We all carry it. But we carry it together. That's what we learned in the Corps, ain't it? Never leave a man behind. And we're not leaving you, son." He continued to talk, weaving tales of resilience, of small moments of beauty found amidst the chaos, of the strength of brotherhood. He didn't preach, he just shared, offering fragments of his own journey, pieces of hard-won wisdom. He told Mike about the peace he found in the woods, the way the sound of Eagle Creek could quiet the noise in his head. He spoke of David, the Marine who had been where Mike was, and how he found solace in nature. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the sounds inside the garage changed. The clinking stopped. The heavy breathing began to even out, replaced by ragged, tearful gasps. Eli knew he was getting through. He had found a foothold, a tiny crack in the thick walls Mike had built around himself. The minutes stretched into an hour, Eli's voice a constant, calming presence against the frigid night air. He spoke not just of shared trauma, but of the raw, undeniable beauty of survival. He talked about seeing sunlight filter through dust after a firefight, about the shared cigarette that tasted like victory, about the moments of profound, unspoken connection with his men when they knew, without a word, that they had each other's backs. He told Mike about the little Afghan girl and her poppy, about the fragile beauty that could exist even in desolation. He spoke of the hard-won peace he had found in the quiet rhythms of the Eagle Creek woods, how the rustle of leaves could replace the ringing in his ears, how the flowing water could wash away the echoes of distant screams. He spoke of David's transformation, a living testament to the healing power of shared vulnerability and nature. "It's not weak to ask for help, Mike," Eli said, his voice soft but firm, a clear instruction. "It takes a different kind of courage. The kind you probably never imagined you had left. But it's there. It's the courage to keep fighting, even when the enemy is inside your own head. And you're not fighting alone anymore. Look around, son. You've got people here who care. And you've got a whole group of veterans waiting for you. Guys who get it. Guys who've been there. Guys who know how to help you carry the load." A long, agonizing silence followed. The deputies shifted nervously, Sarah wrung her hands, and Maria watched Eli with wide, desperate eyes, her hope a fragile flicker in the harsh light of the patrol car. Eli waited patiently, his own breath misting in the cold air. He knew this moment. It was the moment of decision, the razor's edge between holding on and letting go. He felt a deep, unspoken bond with Mike, a shared understanding of the abyss. Then, with a creaking groan, the garage door began to rise, slowly, hesitantly, revealing a sliver of darkness, then a wider opening. Eli remained kneeling, not moving, not breaking the fragile connection. Inside, Mike Rodriguez stood, silhouetted against the dim light of a bare bulb, his face haggard, eyes bloodshot and swollen, the faint scar above his eyebrow stark against his pale skin. He clutched an empty bottle in one hand, his posture conveying a profound weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. His clothes were disheveled, his hair matted, and he looked utterly defeated, a shadow of the strong ranger he once was. Eli slowly stood up, careful not to make any sudden movements. He met Mike's gaze not with pity, but with a deep, unwavering recognition. "Welcome back, Mike," Eli said simply, his voice cracking slightly with emotion. "It's good to see you." Mike's eyes, dull and lifeless a moment before, flickered with something akin to surprise, then a raw, overwhelming relief. The bottle slipped from his grasp and clattered to the concrete floor. He took a tentative step forward, then another, until he was standing just inside the garage opening, blinking at the pulsating blue and red lights. Maria rushed forward, throwing her arms around her husband, sobbing with relief. The deputies relaxed, their hands moving away from their holsters. Sarah let out a long, shuddering breath. Eli just watched, a quiet satisfaction settling over him. He had seen countless battles, but this one, fought with words and empathy, felt as significant as any. Over the next few weeks, Mike Rodriguez became a regular at the Eagle Creek Veterans Wilderness Program. He was quiet at first, like Eli had been, listening more than he spoke. But slowly, steadily, the wilderness, and the camaraderie of his fellow veterans, began to work their magic. He joined Eli on long walks through the snowy woods, the crisp air clearing his mind, the silence of the forest providing a balm for his tormented thoughts. He learned to identify bird calls, to track deer, to find solace in the simple, grounding act of placing one foot in front of the other on a peaceful trail. He shared his own experiences in the group, the terrifying close calls, the relentless patrols, the moments of moral injury that had chipped away at his soul. He spoke of the fear of failure, the weight of responsibility for his men, the struggle to reconcile the horrors of war with the desire for a normal life. And in return, he received not judgment, but understanding, not solutions, but shared empathy. Marcus shared stories of his own physical recovery, Emily offered strategies for dealing with intrusive thoughts, and David, once tormented by nightmares, taught Mike simple grounding exercises he had learned from Eli and refined himself. The program proved its worth time and again. It was more than just a support group, it was a living, breathing community, a sanctuary for those who carried the invisible wounds of war. Eli, who had once believed himself beyond repair, found a new purpose, a new meaning in his own life by guiding others towards healing. He realized that the quiet strength he had cultivated in the Marines, that ability to remain calm in chaos, to read the terrain and guide others, was now being applied to a different kind of battlefield, the hearts and minds of his fellow veterans. The story of Mike Rodriguez's rescue spread quietly through the veteran community, solidifying the reputation of the Eagle Creek Veterans Wilderness Program as more than just a therapy group. It was a beacon of hope. Other veterans, previously hesitant or unreachable, began to seek them out, drawn by the raw authenticity of Eli's approach and the visible transformations of those who had joined. The program, once a small, informal gathering, blossomed into a recognized model for veteran support, attracting attention from regional and even national organizations. Sarah Jenkins, with her tireless dedication and newfound fundraising success, secured significant grants. These funds allowed them to expand their reach, hiring additional trained therapists who specialized in trauma, but always maintaining the core peer-led, nature-based approach. They acquired a larger, accessible van, ensuring veterans with physical disabilities could also join their wilderness excursions. They even began to convert an old, disused barn on the outskirts of Eli's property into a dedicated retreat center, a safe haven where veterans could stay for extended periods, fully immersed in the healing environment of the mountains, away from the triggers of civilian life. Eli, though now well into his 80s, remained the program's spiritual backbone. His hair had thinned to a wispy white, and his walk was slower, but his pale blue eyes still held the same profound depth and quiet intensity. He no longer led the most strenuous expeditions, but he would still sit by the campfire, sharing stories from his life, both military and civilian, weaving tales of resilience and the enduring power of the human spirit. Young veterans, fresh from their deployments, would gather around him, hanging on his every word, finding comfort and wisdom in the presence of this living legend. He was the embodiment of what they aspired to be, a survivor who had not only found peace but had dedicated his life to helping others find theirs. Sarah Jenkins, though now directing a much larger organization, remained fiercely committed to the Eagle Creek Center. She often joked that Eli was her toughest, but most rewarding, client. Their relationship had evolved into a deep, unspoken partnership, built on mutual respect and shared purpose. She handled the administrative complexities, the fundraising, the political advocacy, allowing Eli and the core team to focus on what they did best, guiding veterans towards healing in the embrace of nature. Marcus, Emily, and David, now seasoned veterans themselves, were pillars of the program. Marcus oversaw the health and wellness initiatives, ensuring that physical recovery went hand in hand with mental and emotional healing. Emily, ever the strategist, developed educational programs, sharing the Eagle Creek model with other veteran organizations across the country. David, having conquered his own demons, became a compassionate and powerful group facilitator, his once nervous hands now steady as he guided others through their darkest moments. They were Eli's legacy, living proof of the program's profound impact. The veteran community, once fragmented and struggling in silence, had found a voice and a home in Eagle Creek. They built cabins, tended gardens, and maintained the trails, each act of service a form of therapy. They formed lifelong bonds, a new kind of family forged not in the fire of combat, but in the slow, painstaking process of recovery. They understood that healing was not a destination, but an unending journey, a continuous process of self-discovery and growth. They learned that the scars would always be there, but they no longer had to define them. Instead, they became badges of honor, testaments to their resilience, reminders of the strength they had found within themselves and in each other. One warm summer afternoon, Eli sat on his porch swing, the wooden bird he had carved so many years ago clutched in his hand. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. He watched as a group of veterans, led by David, hiked back towards the center, their laughter echoing through the trees. He saw Mike Rodriguez among them, his stride strong, his face alight with a peace that Eli had once thought impossible for him. Mike had found love again, started a family, and was now a mentor in the program, living proof that life, even after unimaginable trauma, could be full and meaningful. Eli thought of Sergeant Miller, of the Afghan children, of all the faces that had haunted him for so long. The echoes were still there, faint but present, woven into the fabric of his memory. But now, they were intertwined with new sounds, the joyful shouts of veterans on the trails, the quiet hum of conversation around the campfire, the steady rhythm of lives being rebuilt. The weight was still there, but it was no longer crushing. It was something he carried with purpose, a reminder of the path he had walked and the lives he had touched. He looked at the wooden bird in his hand, its smooth surface worn by countless touches. It was a symbol of hope, a tangible reminder of a young man's promise to a terrified lieutenant. And now, it was a symbol of so much more, of connection, of understanding, of the enduring power of the human spirit to find its way home, even from the darkest of places. Eli took a deep breath, the scent of pine and damp earth filling his lungs. The battle wasn't over, not truly. Life was an unending journey, filled with new challenges and new echoes. But now, he wasn't fighting alone. He had found his purpose in these mountains, a legacy forged in shared pain and collective healing. The echoes of Eagle Creek, once a haunting reminder of loss, had transformed into a symphony of hope, a testament to the quiet strength of those who dared to heal, together. And in that symphony, Eli Carter, the silent warrior, finally found his true peace.